April 9, 1944. Mid-Atlantic, approximately 800 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. Korvettenkapitein Harald Lange stood in U-505's conning tower, scanning an empty horizon through salt-crusted binoculars. For 73 days, his boat had patrolled these waters, searching for Allied shipping. The crew had spotted nothing, not a single merchant ship, not even a straggler. The Atlantic that had once teemed with targets now seemed deliberately emptied, as if some invisible hand had swept the ocean clean precisely where U-505 hunted. Below decks, the crew moved through their routines with the mechanical efficiency of men who had long since stopped believing in victory. The control room stank of unwashed bodies, diesel oil, and the peculiar metallic smell that came from breathing the same recycled air for weeks. In the torpedo room, the weapons sat unused, their mechanisms checked and rechecked by men who knew they would likely never fire them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The boat had been at sea since mid-March, burning fuel and accomplishing nothing except evading the aircraft that seemed to appear with impossible frequency, no matter how carefully Lange plotted his movements. What Lange didn't know, what his superiors at U-boat headquarters in Paris refused to believe, was that Allied codebreakers had been reading his radio transmissions for weeks. Every position report, every request for orders, every frustrated message about the absence of shipping had been intercepted, decrypted within hours, and used to route convoys away from his patrol area. The British government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park had broken the German naval Enigma system so thoroughly that convoy planners in Liverpool could predict U-boat movements days in advance. U-505 wasn't hunting in empty ocean by bad luck. It was being deliberately starved of targets while Allied shipping flowed around it in carefully routed channels that German intelligence never detected. But the real shock, the revelation that would shatter German confidence more completely than any single technological breakthrough, was still approaching from over the horizon. At 1400 hours, the hydrophone operator reported faint propeller sounds, multiple contacts, many propellers. Lange ordered battle stations and brought U-505 to periscope depth, the crew moving to their positions with practiced silence. The boat rose slowly through the temperature layers, every man listening for the sounds that would indicate they'd been detected. At 20 meters, Lange raised the search periscope carefully, keeping only the tip above the surface to minimize the wake that might betray their position. What he saw through the periscope lens seemed impossible at first. His mind struggled to process the image. A convoy, yes. 40 or 50 merchant ships in neat columns stretching across miles of ocean. Liberty ships, tankers, cargo vessels, the kind of targets that U-boats had once hunted with impunity. But surrounding them, encircling them in layers of steel and guns, were more warships than Lange had seen protecting any convoy in his entire career, dating back to 1942. He counted them twice, then a third time to be certain. 12 distinct escort vessels in the inner screen, their hulls cutting white wakes as they zigzagged around the merchants. Then an outer screen with 4 more. Then, impossibly, additional warships patrolling farther out, perhaps 2 or 3 kilometers from the main body of the convoy. Lange rotated the periscope slowly, his hands steady despite the ice forming in his gut. 20 escort vessels, perhaps more, for a convoy that appeared to carry nothing more valuable than bulk cargo and fuel. He'd attacked convoys carrying troops to North Africa in 1943 that had been protected by fewer than half this number. He'd evaded Royal Navy destroyer screens around Mediterranean convoys bound for Malta, with 8 or 9 escorts. This was something different. This was protection that would have seemed excessive for a battleship task force. And then, as U-505 crept closer for a better tactical assessment, aircraft appeared. Not one patrol plane making its routine sweep before flying on, multiple aircraft, at least 3, possibly 4, orbiting the convoy in overlapping patterns. One circled the convoy clockwise at perhaps 1,500 meters altitude. Another flew counterclockwise at a different altitude. A third patrolled ahead of the merchant ships, and a fourth, Lange, watched it through the periscope, flew a figure-8 pattern astern. The coverage was continuous, comprehensive, leaving no surface approaches possible. Any U-boat attempting to position ahead of this convoy would be spotted long before it could achieve firing position. He watched for 10 more minutes, the periscope raised only seconds at a time to avoid detection. The escorts weren't sailing in defensive positions close to the merchants. They were hunting. 3 of the outer screen warships were clearly conducting active sonar searches in a coordinated pattern. Their movements weren't random. They were executing a systematic search plan, covering overlapping sectors, ensuring that no U-boat could approach undetected. These weren't ships waiting to respond to an attack. They were ships looking for submarines to kill before those submarines could ever threaten the convoy. Lange ordered the boat down to 150 meters and withdrew from the area on electric motors, making barely 3 knots. In his war diary, which Allied intelligence teams would recover 2 months later when U-505 was captured, Lange recorded what he'd witnessed with a note that betrayed his bewilderment. The enemy appears to possess unlimited numbers of escort vessels. Where previously we might encounter 5 or 6 escorts with a large convoy, we now face 15 or 20. And they do not merely defend passively. They hunt aggressively, in coordinated groups, as if they know exactly where we are before we ever transmit a position report. This patrol has been entirely without success. In 73 days, we have not fired a single torpedo. The boat is low on fuel and supplies. Am returning to base. 4 weeks later, on June 4, 1944, U-505 would surface into a killing zone. American destroyer escorts from Task Group 22.3, led by the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, had been tracking Lange's boat for hours, using high-frequency direction-finding equipment that could pinpoint a U-boat's position from a single 30-second radio transmission. When depth charges forced U-505 to the surface with its crew desperate for air and the hull creaking from pressure damage, boarding parties from USS Pillsbury would storm aboard and capture the submarine intact, along with her Enigma machines and code books. It would be one of the greatest intelligence coups of the Atlantic War. But the real victory, the one that would end Germany's Atlantic campaign far more decisively than any single capture, had already been won months earlier through a transformation in Allied industrial capacity that German planners had never anticipated and could not counter. The story of how German U-boat commanders went from confident hunters to hunted prey isn't primarily about radar or code-breaking, though both played crucial roles. It's not even primarily about tactics or training, though the Allies excelled at both. It's about something more fundamental and more psychologically devastating. It's about mathematics, industrial mathematics. The cold calculation that in modern warfare, the side that can build weapons faster than the enemy can destroy them will ultimately win, regardless of tactical skill, operational courage, or even technological sophistication. And in 1943, American shipyards began producing escort vessels and escort carriers at rates that made German submarine construction look almost quaint by comparison, like comparing an artillery barrage to a rifle shot. The transformation began not with any single decision, but with systematic planning that had started years before the United States officially entered the war. As early as 1940, American naval observers in London had watched British convoys struggle and British escorts die, and they had taken detailed notes on every failure, every weakness, every tactical gap that German U-boats exploited. These reports flowed back to Washington, where planners who were still technically neutral began asking questions about how America would protect Atlantic shipping if when the country entered the war. In March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor forced America's hand, British naval officers met with American shipbuilding executives at the Navy Department to discuss a problem that threatened Britain's survival more than the Luftwaffe bombing campaign, more than Rommel in North Africa, more than the Japanese threat in Asia. The Royal Navy needed hundreds of additional escort vessels to protect Atlantic convoys that were being savaged by U-boat wolfpacks. British shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity, building fleet destroyers, cruisers, and the larger warships needed to challenge Germany's surface fleet. The small escort vessels that actually won convoy battles couldn't be built in sufficient numbers. Could American yards design and build a new type of warship specifically optimized for anti-submarine warfare and, critically, optimized for mass production at industrial scale? Captain E.L. Cochran of the American Bureau of Shipping examined the requirements with an engineer's eye for both performance and manufacturability. He needed to create a ship that could hunt submarines effectively, while being simple enough to build that workers who'd never constructed warships could assemble them in months rather than years. His destroyer escort design was radical in its practicality. The ships would be smaller than fleet destroyers, displacing about 1,400 tons compared to 2,000 tons for a fleet destroyer. They would be powered by diesel engines or turbine electric drives that didn't compete with other war production priorities. The same diesel technology used in locomotives and the turbo-electric systems used in submarines. They would be armed specifically for hunting submarines rather than fighting surface battles. 3-inch or 5-inch guns instead of the larger 5-inch 38s, depth charge racks, and the new Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar that would revolutionize underwater warfare. Most importantly, Cochran designed the ships for rapid construction using prefabrication techniques and assembly line manufacturing principles that had never been applied to warship construction. Entire hull sections would be built in different facilities, then transported to shipyards for welding together. Standardized equipment packages would be manufactured by subcontractors and installed as complete units. Workers could specialize in specific tasks rather than needing the broad skills of traditional shipwrights. The destroyer escort wasn't just a warship design. It was an industrial manufacturing system disguised as a ship. The initial order called for 50 vessels to be built under Lend-Lease arrangements for the Royal Navy, which would designate them the Captain class. But when the United States entered the war in December 1941, American planners realized they needed the same ships in even greater numbers. The escort requirement estimates grew from 50 ships to 100, then 200, then more. By January 1943, after months of tooling up and worker training, 16 American shipyards from Massachusetts to California were gearing up to produce destroyer escorts in quantities that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The first destroyer escorts, the Evarts class, entered service in early 1943. USS Evarts, designated DE-5, commissioned in April 1943. These short-hull vessels measured 290 feet long and displaced about 1,400 tons. They were cramped, uncomfortable, and rolled terribly in heavy seas crews called them murderous in Atlantic storms. But they worked. They mounted 3 3-inch 50-caliber guns, depth charge racks capable of carrying dozens of charges, and the new Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar that revolutionized underwater warfare by firing 24 projectiles ahead of the ship in an elliptical pattern. The key innovation of Hedgehog was that the projectiles only exploded on contact with a submarine's hull. Traditional depth charges exploded at preset depths, whether they hit anything or not, creating massive disturbance that made sonar useless for minutes afterward. Hedgehog allowed escorts to maintain sonar contact right up to the moment of attack, dramatically improving accuracy. The Evarts class proved the destroyer escort concept worked, but subsequent classes improved the design based on combat experience. The Buckley class, at 306 feet and 1,600 tons, offered better seakeeping and longer range. These ships could cross the Atlantic and back without refueling, crucial for escort work. 102 Buckley-class destroyer escorts were launched in 1943 and 44 from shipyards that included Bethlehem Steel in Hingham, Massachusetts, and Charleston Navy Yard in South Carolina. Workers who'd been building merchant ships 6 months earlier were now welding together submarine hunters, trained in weeks through intensive programs that broke complex shipbuilding into learnable tasks. The Cannon class used diesel-electric propulsion for reliability and range. 85 units were completed, named for naval heroes who died earlier in the war, a deliberate choice to honor sacrifice while reminding crews they were fighting for men who'd gone before them. The Edsall class featured direct-drive diesels with different reduction gears, 85 more ships. 37 of these were manned by United States Coast Guard crews, creating specialized anti-submarine groups that blended Navy and Coast Guard experience. The Ruddero and John C. Butler classes mounted 5-inch guns instead of 3-inch weapons, providing better surface firepower while maintaining anti-submarine capability. They featured redesigned, lower superstructures for better stability and to reduce radar signature. 72 Rudderos and 85 Butlers joined the fleet between late 1943 and 1945. By the end of 1943, American yards were launching destroyer escorts at an average rate of 17 ships per month, not per year, per month. Let that sink in for a moment. In the time it took Germany to build and commission 2 or 3 U-boats, a process requiring 6 months from keel laying to working up the crew. American shipyards were delivering 17 destroyer escorts, fully equipped with radar, sonar, hedgehog mortars, depth charges, and crews trained to hunt submarines. The mathematics were staggering and profoundly frightening for anyone who understood their implications. Germany was building U-boats at approximately 20 to 24 per month at peak production in 1943. The United States alone was producing nearly as many submarine hunters as Germany was building submarines. And that didn't count British destroyer escort and corvette construction, Canadian frigate production, or the hundreds of other escort vessels being delivered by Allied yards. The industrial asymmetry became even more stark when you factored in attrition rates. When a destroyer escort was damaged in combat, hit by a torpedo, bombed by an aircraft, rammed by a U-boat, it could usually be repaired in weeks. Allied shipyards had spare parts, trained workers, and undamaged facilities. Some badly damaged destroyers' escorts were even cut in half, had new sections welded in, and returned to service within months. When a U-boat was damaged severely enough to require dockyard repairs, it might spend 6 months in port competing for increasingly scarce materials, skilled labor that was being killed in Allied bombing raids, and repair facilities that were themselves being systematically destroyed by RAF Bomber Command and the US 8th Air Force. And when a destroyer escort was sunk, and some were, 4 were lost to U-boat action during the war, American yards could replace it in less than 3 months, from keel laying to commissioning. When a U-boat was destroyed, Germany lost not just the submarine, but its irreplaceable crew. Training a competent U-boat crew required 6 to 8 months of specialized instruction, assuming experienced instructors were available, and training facilities weren't being bombed. By late 1943, German submarine training schools were losing instructors to combat faster than experienced crews could replace them. Green commanders with minimal experience were being sent to sea with green crews, creating boats that were sunk on their first patrols before they learned the survival techniques that veterans took for granted. But raw numbers tell only part of the story. The psychological impact on German U-boat commanders of facing this industrial avalanche was profound and devastating in ways that pure statistics cannot capture. Korvettenkapitän Peter Kramer, commanding U-333 through multiple patrols from 1943 through 1945, described the shock in his post-war memoir published in 1984. In 1942, we calculated that if we could sink ships faster than Allied yards could replace them, we would win the tonnage war. The mathematics seemed simple, even inevitable. Admiral Dönitz had calculated that sinking 700,000 tons of merchant shipping per month would starve Britain into surrender within a year. We achieved that rate several times in 1942. Victory seemed merely a matter of maintaining pressure, sinking enough ships, killing enough sailors. But by mid-1943, Kramer continued, we faced a different calculation entirely. Even when we successfully attacked convoys, sinking multiple merchant ships in a single night of wolfpack attacks, the escorts hunting us never seemed to diminish. We would evade one group of destroyers only to encounter another, and another. As if the Allies possessed infinite reserves. The ocean that had seemed so vast in 1940 became suffocatingly small in 1943. Everywhere we surfaced, aircraft appeared. Every convoy we sighted came with escorts we couldn't overwhelm. Every attack, even successful attacks, brought such intense response that survival became more important than sinking tonnage. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The concept that broke German morale more completely than any weapon or technology was the support group. Unlike regular convoy escorts that stayed with their assigned merchant ships from port to port, support groups were roving reinforcement forces positioned throughout the Atlantic, ready to race to any convoy under attack. Admiral Max Horton, commanding Western Approaches Command from his headquarters in Liverpool, organized these groups in April 1943 using the growing numbers of escort vessels becoming available from American and British production. Each support group consisted of 4 to 6 warships, typically sloops, frigates, or destroyer escorts, commanded by experienced anti-submarine warfare specialists who'd already survived multiple convoy battles and knew U-boat tactics intimately. The tactical advantage was revolutionary and psychologically devastating for U-boat crews. When a U-boat reported a convoy position by radio as Wolfpack tactics required. High-frequency direction-finding equipment on the convoy's regular escorts would detect the transmission and determine its bearing with remarkable precision. Within hours, a support group would be racing to that position at maximum speed, 25 or 30 knots, covering the distance while the U-boat was still maneuvering into attack position. The U-boat commander who transmitted that report, thinking he was summoning fellow submarines to share the kill, would find himself not attacking a vulnerable convoy but being hunted by fresh warships that could pursue him for days without worrying about leaving merchant ships unprotected. Captain Frederick John Walker commanded the second support group from HMS Starling beginning in April 1943. Walker was already a legend in the Royal Navy's anti-submarine warfare community, having survived 3 years of convoy battles and developed tactics that turned defensive escort work into offensive submarine hunting. His second support group consisted of 6 sloops: Starling, Cygnet, Kite, Wild Goose, Woodpecker, and Wren. Over the next year, this single group would sink 15 German U-boats and damage several others so severely they spent months in repair docks. Walker pioneered the hold-down tactic, where his ships would track a submerged U-boat continuously using sonar, forcing it to remain underwater until its batteries died and air ran out. This might take 2 or 3 days of continuous hunting. The support group ships would rotate patrol positions overhead, some actively searching with sonar, while others rested their crews and refueled from tankers if necessary. Eventually, inevitably, the U-boat would have to surface. When it did, Walker's group would be waiting with guns and depth charges. U-boats couldn't hide, couldn't escape, couldn't outlast ships that were supported by an industrial system that could keep them supplied indefinitely. On July 30th, 1943, Walker's second support group encountered 3 U-boats on the surface in the Bay of Biscay. Walker signaled general chase to his group and opened fire at maximum range, preventing the submarines from diving safely. His ships pounded all 3 boats with gunfire, sinking one and forcing the other 2 to limp back to port heavily damaged. The battle lasted hours and demonstrated what well-trained, well-equipped escorts could achieve when freed from defensive convoy protection duties. They could hunt U-boats to destruction with a relentlessness that shattered German morale. By summer 1943, the Royal Navy was operating 5 support groups in the North Atlantic. The United States Navy added its own variant, the Hunter-Killer Group, built around escort carriers and even more devastating in its psychological impact. These groups didn't escort convoys at all. They hunted U-boats independently, using intelligence from decrypted German communications to position themselves where submarines were refueling from tanker U-boats or forming into wolf packs before attacking convoys. The escort carrier, designated CVE in naval terminology, nicknamed Jeep carriers by crews, or occasionally baby flat tops, was the second industrial miracle that multiplied Allied anti-submarine forces beyond German calculations. These small carriers were built on merchant ship hulls using construction techniques similar to the Liberty ship program that was simultaneously flooding the Atlantic with merchant tonnage faster than U-boats could sink it. Escort carriers displaced about 10,000 tons, roughly one-third the size of fleet carriers like Enterprise or Yorktown. They were slow, making 18 knots maximum compared to 33 knots for fleet carriers. They were lightly armed and vulnerable to torpedo attack. Escorts had to protect the protector. But they could be built in months rather than years, and they provided something U-boats had never faced before: continuous air coverage over convoys throughout the entire Atlantic crossing. The first escort carrier, USS Long Island, had been converted from a merchant ship in 1941 as an experiment to prove the concept worked. By 1943, American shipyards were launching escort carriers monthly from assembly lines that treated aircraft carriers like automobiles, complex machines built from standardized parts by specialized workers. USS Bogue entered Atlantic convoy duty in March 1943. Her Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and F-4F Wildcat fighters could detect U-boats from 20 miles away using 10-centimeter wavelength radar that German warning receivers couldn't detect. The aircraft could attack surfaced submarines with depth bombs, or the new Mark 24 mine, actually an acoustic homing torpedo called Fido, before U-boats knew they'd been spotted. The tactical impact was immediate and devastating. U-boats had previously surfaced at night to charge batteries using their diesel engines, a process that took 8 to 10 hours to fully recharge. They'd race ahead of convoys on the surface at 17 knots, far faster than their 7-knot submerged speed, positioning themselves for dawn attacks. With escort carrier aircraft orbiting overhead continuously, 24 hours a day, regardless of weather, surfacing meant appearing on radar screens and having 500-pound depth bombs dropped on you within minutes. The sky that had once been empty, except for the occasional land-based patrol aircraft, was now filled with enemies. Convoy HX-233 in April 1943 demonstrated the new reality with brutal clarity. Bogue's aircraft spotted 4 U-boats shadowing the convoy, submarines that in 1942 would have coordinated a wolfpack attack and probably sunk a dozen merchants. All 4 were forced to dive immediately, losing contact with the convoy and unable to report its position to U-boat headquarters. 1. U-203, under the command of Captain Lieutenant Herman Kottmann, was caught on the surface attempting to escape. Aircraft from Bogue attacked with depth bombs, destroying the submarine with all 48 crew lost. The convoy crossed without losing a single merchant ship. The exchange rate had reversed: 1 U-boat sunk, 0 merchants lost. By mid-1944, the United States Navy operated over 100 escort carriers. Not all served in the Atlantic, many fought in the Pacific, providing air cover for amphibious landings and hunting Japanese submarines. But dozens patrolled Atlantic convoy routes, meaning that at any given time, roughly 2,000 to 3,000 anti-submarine aircraft operated at sea, independent of land-based patrol bombers flying from bases in Newfoundland, Iceland, Greenland, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Add land-based aircraft to carrier aircraft and the total reached staggering numbers. The sky over the Atlantic had become infested with Allied aircraft, as German U-boat commanders described it in their reports, making surface operations suicidal and submerged operations increasingly difficult, as aircraft could spot periscope wakes and snorkel exhausts even in moderate seas. Captain Daniel Gallery commanded Task Group 22.3, built around escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. Gallery was an aggressive, innovative officer who saw U-boat hunting as offense, not defense. His philosophy was simple and devastating, recorded in his own words in post-war memoirs. "We're not here to escort anything. We're here to sink submarines. Every U-boat we destroy is one less boat that can threaten convoys next month. The best defense is making sure there are no U-boats left to attack in the first place." Gallery's hunter-killer group, which included destroyer escorts USS Pillsbury, Pope, Flaherty, Chatelaine, and Jenks, roamed the Central Atlantic from May 1943 through June 1944. They sank multiple U-boats using a coordinated system that combined signals intelligence with aggressive tactics. When codebreakers identified a U-boat refueling rendezvous tanker, U-boats called milch cows would meet operational boats mid-ocean to transfer fuel and supplies. Gallery's group would race to that position. They'd arrive just as the boats surfaced to transfer fuel, catching them vulnerable and unable to dive quickly. In one celebrated action in June 1944, Gallery's group forced U-505 to surface and captured it intact, the only German submarine captured on the high seas during the entire war. The intelligence haul included codebooks, Enigma machines, and operational documents that further enhanced Allied anti-submarine capabilities. The numbers reveal the industrial asymmetry more clearly than any tactical analysis or individual battle narrative. Between January 1943 and May 1945, American shipyards delivered 563 destroyer escorts. Additional hundreds of corvettes, frigates, and patrol craft came from British and Canadian yards. Britain built 78 captain-class frigates. Canada produced numerous river-class frigates and corvettes. At the same time, Germany commissioned approximately 800 U-boats during the entire war. But here's the crucial difference that German planners had failed to anticipate and couldn't overcome once they understood it. When a destroyer escort was damaged in combat, it could be repaired in weeks. Shipyards had spare parts stockpiled, trained workers who could work 3 shifts around the clock, and undamaged facilities with electricity, tools and materials. USS Donnell, a Buckley-class destroyer escort, was torpedoed by U-boat in May 1944 while defending a convoy off the British Isles. The torpedoes struck midships, killing 29 crew, and blowing a massive hole in the hull. Damage control teams saved the ship from sinking, and it was towed to Cherbourg, where its still serviceable power plant was used to generate electricity for the newly liberated French port. The ship couldn't be repaired enough to return to combat, but even wrecked it served a useful purpose. When a U-boat was damaged, it might spend months in dock competing for increasingly scarce materials, skilled labor that was being killed in Allied bombing raids on German cities, and repair facilities that were themselves being systematically destroyed. Allied bombers targeted U-boat pens in French ports repeatedly, though the massive concrete structures proved nearly impossible to penetrate with bombs available in 1943 and 44. What the bombing did achieve was destruction of machine shops, worker housing, power plants, and transportation networks around the pens, making repairs slow and difficult. And when a destroyer escort was sunk, and some were, like USS Leopold torpedoed in March 1944 with heavy loss of life, or USS Rich sunk by mines off Normandy in June 1944 American yards, could replace it in less than 3 months, from keel laying to commissioning. The industrial system didn't just build ships, it built them continuously, automatically, like a factory that never stopped production. When a U-boat was destroyed, Germany lost not just the submarine, but its irreplaceable crew. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, roughly 30,000 would die, representing a catastrophic 75% casualty rate, the highest of any military service on either side of the conflict in any theatre. Oberleutnant Harold Lange's experience with U-505 illustrates the psychological impact of fighting against industrial mathematics. The boat had been launched in November 1942 at Deutsche Werft in Hamburg with high hopes. She was a Type 9C boat, larger than the more common Type 7 boats, with longer range and heavier torpedo loadout. On her first patrol under Kapitänleutnant Axel Olaf Loewe, she sank a 7,200-ton British freighter off Freetown, West Africa, in November 1942. Initial success suggested the boat would be lucky. But then, everything went wrong. During the same patrol, U-505 was depth-charged by twin-engine aircraft and severely damaged, barely making it back to France. She spent 7 months in repair docks at Lorient, while her crew was reassigned to shore duties or other boats. When she finally sortied again in July 1943, this time under 24-year-old Peter Zeszek, she broke down repeatedly. One diesel engine locked up, the trim pump failed. The boat returned to port after accomplishing nothing. On her next attempt in October 1943, she was attacked by British destroyers and depth-charged so severely that Commander Zeszek committed suicide with a pistol during the attack. unable to endure the psychological pressure of being hunted continuously while unable to strike back effectively. When Lange took command in March 1944, U-505's crew knew they were hexed, as one crewman recorded in his diary found after the boat's capture. "The hex is still with us. This boat is cursed. We have sailed 4 times and achieved nothing except survival. Men die and boats sink all around us while we accomplish nothing." But their failure to find shipping had nothing to do with luck or curses. Allied naval intelligence tracked U-505 through her radio transmissions and routed all merchant ships away from her patrol areas. The submarine spent 2.5 months at sea without spotting a single target, not because the Atlantic was empty, but because the Allies could afford to route convoys around known U-boat positions, while still maintaining sufficient merchant tonnage flow to supply Britain's war effort. This was the calculation that Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz couldn't overcome, though he understood it by mid-1943 with terrible clarity. In 1942, he had calculated that sinking 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month sustained over a year would starve Britain into surrender. The calculation was based on estimates of British import requirements, shipbuilding capacity, and U-boat operational rates. It had seemed achievable. In November 1942, U-boats worldwide sank 119 merchant ships, totaling about 729,000 tons. The target was being met, but that calculation assumed Allied shipbuilding capacity remained static or grew slowly, while U-boat numbers increased steadily. The actual situation reversed his mathematics completely, catastrophically. In 1943, American shipyards alone launched over 11 million tons of merchant shipping. 11 million tons. In 1 year, from a standing start in 1941 when American merchant shipbuilding was negligible, the United States had created an industrial miracle. The Liberty Ship program, with its average construction time of 42 days from keel laying to delivery, meant that even in May 1943, the worst month of U-boat losses when Germany lost 41 submarines, Allied shipyards launched more than 900,000 tons of new merchant vessels. Germany was trying to empty a bathtub with a teaspoon, while America filled it with a fire hose. Worse, from Dönitz's perspective, the teaspoon kept breaking. U-boats were being destroyed faster than they could sink tonnage. The exchange rate had become catastrophically negative. For every ton of shipping sunk, Germany was losing submarine capacity it couldn't replace. The famous Liberty Ship construction program demonstrated industrial capacity that German planners had never anticipated when they designed their submarine warfare strategy. Henry Kaiser's Richmond Shipyard No. 2 in California employed over 90,000 workers at peak production. 90,000. More people than lived in many German cities. The shipyard launched a completed Liberty ship every 36 hours on average. Some were built faster, the SS Robert E. Peary was famously constructed in 4 days and 15 hours in November 1942 as a publicity demonstration to boost war bond sales, though typical construction time was 5 to 6 weeks from start to finish. By war's end, American yards had delivered 2,610 Liberty ships, each one capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo, plus hundreds of faster Victory ships with better engines and more cargo capacity, plus hundreds of tankers to carry the fuel that kept Allied war machines running, plus specialized cargo vessels, troop transports, hospital ships. Each represented cargo capacity the Allies could afford to lose, except they weren't losing them anymore. By mid-1943, merchant ship losses had dropped to levels where replacement exceeded sinkings by comfortable margins. The convoys kept crossing, the supplies kept flowing. Britain's imports, which had been dangerously low in early 1943, recovered steadily through the rest of the year. And the destroyer escorts kept multiplying. German U-boat commanders filed increasingly desperate reports throughout 1943 and 1944 that revealed their growing understanding that they were fighting an unwinnable war of industrial attrition. Kapitänleutnant Siegfried von Forstner, commanding U-402, reported after a failed attack in July 1943, We achieved firing position against the convoy despite intense escort activity. Target was approximately 40 merchants in neat columns, apparently carrying bulk cargo given their deep draft. Before we could launch torpedoes, 4 additional warships appeared from different directions simultaneously, moving at high speed directly toward our position, though we had not been detected by the original escorts. We were forced to crash dive to 180 meters and endured 8 hours of continuous depth charging. The accuracy was remarkable. They knew where we were within a few dozen meters. When we finally surfaced that night to recharge batteries and attempt to escape the area, aircraft appeared within minutes, forcing another emergency dive. We have concluded that the Allies possess detection methods we cannot evade and reinforcement capabilities we cannot overcome. Korvettenkapitän Klaus Bargston, commanding U-521 during multiple patrols in 1944, described a pattern that repeated across dozens of patrol reports preserved in German naval archives. The moment we report a convoy sighting by radio, additional escorts appear within hours. Not the original escort group, which remains with the merchants in their defensive screen, but fresh warships clearly dispatched to hunt specifically for the boat that made the report. It's as if our radio transmissions summon our own executioners. We have been forced to maintain radio silence except for absolutely critical reports, which cripples our ability to coordinate attacks. The Wolfpack tactics that made us so effective in 1941 and 42 have become suicide tactics. Every transmission is detected. Every position report brings destroyers racing to our location faster than we can evade them. This was exactly what was happening, though German naval intelligence refused to believe the Allies could achieve such precision. High-frequency direction-finding equipment, called Huff-Duff by Allied crews, could triangulate a U-boat's position from a single 30-second radio transmission with remarkable accuracy. The system worked by detecting the radio waves themselves, regardless of whether the message could be decoded. Multiple ships equipped with Huff-Duff receivers would each get a bearing to the transmission source. Where those bearing lines crossed on a chart marked the U-boat's position, usually accurate within a few nautical miles. And with support groups positioned throughout the Atlantic in a network that grew denser as more destroyer escorts entered service, fresh escorts could reach that position within 2 to 4 hours, sometimes faster if a support group happened to be nearby. The U-boat commander who sent that 30-second position report would find 4 or 5 destroyer escorts converging on him before he could maneuver into attack position. The Wolfpack tactic that had made U-boats so devastatingly effective in 1941 and 1942, sinking millions of tons of shipping, had become a death trap that German commanders could not escape from. Dönitz tried desperately to adapt to the changing tactical situation. In September 1943, he introduced acoustic homing torpedoes designated T5 Zaunkönig, meaning wren in English, though U-boat crews called them Gnat torpedoes. These weapons were designed to home on the propeller noise of escort vessels, rather than requiring precise aim at merchant ships. The theory was sound. If U-boats could sink the escorts first, merchant ships would be defenseless. Initial results seemed promising, validating the concept. Several British and Canadian escorts were hit and damaged or sunk. U-boat commanders reported successful attacks. Morale briefly improved. But Allied technical intelligence teams captured an intact T5 torpedo within weeks of its introduction when it failed to detonate after hitting a merchant ship. British engineers reverse-engineered it immediately, understanding its acoustic homing mechanism, and developed the Foxer noisemaker within months. This was a simple device towed behind ships on a long cable, creating loud propeller-like sounds that decoyed the torpedo away from the actual vessel. Manufacturing was simple enough that Foxer devices could be produced in thousands and distributed to escort vessels throughout the Atlantic Fleet. Within 3 months of introduction, T5 effectiveness dropped to nearly zero. U-boats were back to firing conventional torpedoes at targets they could rarely approach closely enough to hit. Every adaptation Germany attempted faced the same insurmountable problem that no amount of tactical innovation or operational courage could overcome. The Allies could analyze captured weapons, counter them with defensive measures, mass-produce those countermeasures, and distribute them to hundreds of ships in the time it took German engineers to move from prototype to limited production of a few dozen units. The industrial capacity gap wasn't just quantitative, though the numbers were overwhelming. It was temporal, a race against time that Germany was losing at every stage. American factories could iterate through design improvements, test them in combat conditions, manufacture them in quantity, using mass production techniques, and distribute them across the entire Atlantic theatre in months. German development cycles took years, hampered by Allied bombing of factories, shortages of critical materials like copper and rubber, and the fragmentation of industrial capacity across a shrinking territory under constant attack. By the time German countermeasures reached operational units, Allied technology had moved forward another generation, rendering the German innovations obsolete before they could affect the strategic situation. The Type 21 Electroboot represented Germany's most ambitious and desperate attempt to regain technological parity and restore the submarine threat. This revolutionary design featured a streamlined hull form derived from extensive hydrodynamic testing, triple the battery capacity of conventional Type 7 boats for extended underwater operations, incredible 17 knots submerged, speed compared to 7 knots for conventional boats, which meant they could outrun most surface escorts underwater, 6 bow torpedo tubes with hydraulic reload capability, allowing 18 torpedoes to be fired in under 20 minutes without surfacing, and sophisticated passive sonar systems for detecting targets without revealing the submarine's position. The Type 21 was genuinely revolutionary, incorporating lessons learned from 5 years of submarine warfare into a design that could theoretically restore German naval dominance. Had this design entered service in 1943 rather than 1945, it might have significantly extended the Battle of the Atlantic and forced the Allies to develop entirely new countermeasures. But rushed production, driven by desperate timelines, created severe quality problems that negated many of the design's advantages. Of 118 boats constructed in various shipyards across Germany using prefabricated sections, only 4 were fully combat-ready before Germany surrendered. The boats suffered from battery failures, hydraulic leaks, structural weaknesses in hull welds, and countless other problems that came from skipping proper testing and quality control. Only 2 Type 21 boats conducted combat patrols in April and May 1945, achieving no sinkings before Germany's unconditional surrender ended all U-boat operations. The final U-boat patrol of the war demonstrated both the Type 21's remarkable potential and the utter futility of deploying advanced weapons when the strategic situation was already irretrievably lost. U-2511, the first Type 21 Electroboot to see operational service, departed Bergen, Norway on April 30th, 1945 under the command of Korvettenkaptein Adalbert Schnee. Schnee was one of Germany's most experienced and successful U-boat commanders, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, with multiple successful patrols and merchant ships sunk to his credit dating back to 1940. If anyone could demonstrate what the Type 21 could achieve, it was Schnee. On May 4, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender, U-2511 detected a British cruiser task force north of the Faroe Islands and executed a perfect attack approach that demonstrated everything the Type 21 could do. The boat's superior underwater speed of 17 knots allowed Schnee to close rapidly while remaining deep enough to avoid detection. Silent running capabilities meant British sonar couldn't detect the approaching submarine. He reached ideal firing position at close range, completely undetected despite the British task force having full radar coverage and multiple destroyers screening the cruisers. Schnee had the perfect shot, multiple targets, no warning, certain kills. He did not fire. Germany had already announced surrender negotiations were underway. The war was effectively over, except for the formalities of signing documents. Firing would accomplish nothing except killing British sailors whose deaths would serve no purpose. Schnee surfaced and radioed his position on May 5, 1945, surrendering U-2511 intact. Ending the U-boat war, not with violence and blood, but with acceptance of defeat and the recognition that further resistance was pointless. In his post-war memoir published decades later when he could speak freely, Schnee reflected on the bitter irony with remarkable clarity. We proved that day what the Type 21 could have achieved had it entered service a year earlier. We penetrated a heavily defended task force completely undetected. We could have sunk multiple capital ships and escaped without being counterattacked. The technology worked perfectly. But such demonstrations were meaningless. The Allies had already won through industrial capacity and technological innovation deployed in 1942 and 1943. Our most advanced technology arrived when the war was already lost, when the outcome had been decided, and when nothing we could do would change the result. The statistical summary of the Battle of the Atlantic confirms the decisive impact of Allied industrial mobilization more clearly than any individual commander's testimony or tactical analysis. From January through May 1943, during the period when destroyer escorts were just entering service in significant numbers and support groups were being organized but not yet fully deployed, U-boats sank 245 merchant ships totaling approximately 1.29 million tons. German losses during this same 5-month period were 95 U-boats, including the catastrophic 41 to 43 boats lost in May alone during what German submariners called Black May. The exchange rate was already becoming unsustainable, with U-boats being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. From June 1943 through May 1944, after destroyer escorts and escort carriers had reached full operational deployment across the Atlantic in overwhelming numbers, merchant ship losses dropped precipitously to 185 ships, totaling approximately 819,000 tons, despite more U-boats being at sea than in the previous period. German losses during this 12-month period climbed catastrophically to 237 U-boats destroyed. The exchange rate had reversed completely. More submarines were being destroyed every month than merchant ships were being sunk. Germany was losing the war of attrition at every level: ships, crews, industrial capacity, strategic position. The mathematics of industrial warfare had trumped tactical skill, operational courage, technological sophistication, and even the legendary determination of German submariners who continued fighting long after rational calculation showed victory was impossible. For German U-boat commanders, the revelation was psychologically devastating in ways that pure military defeat could never achieve. They had not been outfought in honest battle. They had been overwhelmed by industrial arithmetic. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.